Hey, what's up? Meeting people on the internet is a strange thing. Very often, the first thing you learn about someone would be something personal that you might not know about them if you'd met them face-to-face in a coffee shop. You might not learn about them for many years, even if they were a friend that you made in primary school, if they were a friend you made in high school, if they were a friend you made in university, or if they were a friend you met for the first time in the workplace as a grown adult. You might know someone for years without knowing what poster is hanging on their bedroom wall. You may never know that about some of your closest friends. And in the same way, with the internet, sometimes the first thing you learn about somebody is what type of music they listen to and what they think about that music, their personal taste and so on. And you may not know that about your university professors, your work colleagues, or again, friends you've had for years, possibly friends you met in university and high school or what have you. So it is a bit of a funny thing in my life, but it's not entirely surprising to me that so many people have wanted me for a long time now to make a video talking about rap music and the role it's had in my life, why it is that hip-hop, or how it was that hip-hop and rap music really became the one genre of music I listened to, that it came to dominate, my musical interests in my adult life. So in this video, I'm going to skip over sort of the cultural context I grew up in. Could be a much longer video talking about the way hip-hop culture and rap music ascended in Toronto, Canada during my lifetime while I was growing up. How it ascended from something marginal, hated and feared by the mainstream, to being something so powerful that it really redefined the mainstream. And something that just was accepted as a normal and not too threatening part of mainstream culture. That was a transformation that happened before my eyes. But in terms of the role of that culture in my life, the first thing I'd say is that, one of the lessons I had already learned before I started publicly identifying myself as a fan of rap music is really a question about what it means to have a culture at all. A lot of people in Toronto is a little bit influenced by Scottish culture. A lot of people try to snub you and ridicule you just to see how you'll react. They take a poke at you. I don't mind that much, but the Scottish are huge on that. That's really kind of a legacy of Scottish culture in Canada in some ways. I remember a guy at my university, a guy who knew me a little bit. Well, he wasn't my friend at the time, but he knew me a bit. He saw me. That time I had physical CDs in my backpack of rap music. Those were the days. You owned pieces of plastic. And so this guy said, completely contemptuously, he said, "Oh, I suppose if you met these people, you think you would have something in common with them." These people. He was alluding to like Ghostface. He was alluding to like members of Wu-Tang, or represented by the color illustrations of these people. And without me missing a beat, without a moment's hesitation, I looked him in the eye and I said, "That's not the problem. The problem is that you think if you sat down and had a conversation with J.S. Bach that you'd have anything in common. You think that you could sit down with Wagner or Shakespeare and that you represent the same culture just because you're both white." It was a great moment. And, conversation continued from there. He didn't freak out or anything. We talked about it a bit. He really thought about it. And he knew enough, actually, about the composers I mentioned to realize that most of them were kind of religious maniacs. And he actually did reflect on the extent to which he did assume that he had something in common culturally with someone like Wagner or Johann Sebastian Bach, even though intellectually on some level he knew he didn't. He was aware. Johann Sebastian Bach was a complete religious maniac, by the way. Really, to call him eccentric is flattering, and obsessed with numerology and other stuff. That was the first moment when he stopped and reflected that he would be totally incapable of sitting down and having a conversation with Johann Sebastian Bach or Wagner or Shakespeare. And now I have no claim that I could sit down and have a great conversation with Ghostface or Method Man or any of the founding members of Wu-Tang. But that's not important to me. That's not what culture is in my life. And I've actually dealt with that in parallel. I've dealt with that many, many times when white people tried to insult me and reproach me because I studied Cambodia. Like, "Oh, you think you're Cambodian?" No. I'm not a part of Cambodian culture. Cambodian culture is a part of my life. When I studied Korean Ojibwe, I don't think I'm First Nations. I don't think I'm Native American. I don't think I'm part of that. I don't think I'm part of that culture. Studying that culture is part of my life. I care about the politics in that culture, whether you're talking about Cree or Cambodian, whatever. I don't think I'm part of it. And of course, the funny thing is with any of those fields, once you get in deep enough, those people start to claim you, which is also really interesting. I remember one situation Something like this happened about twice only, but I remember once I was speaking Lao, the Laotian language. Say Laotian, but they are just like Lao. Speaking the Lao language in Laos, and I was speaking at a pretty good clip at that particular moment. And then I walked into a hotel. I was speaking it out in the street, and I walked into a hotel, and the guy inside the hotel started trying to explain something to me in English. And a little old lady who had just seen me talk in the street, she talked to me a little bit, but she wasn't there. She actually ran into the hotel, and she said to the guy working in the hotel lobby, she said, no, don't worry about it. He's a white Lao. Like, he's a white Laotian. And, still to this day, I have no idea what that meant. Everyone in the room was like, oh, okay. And then they started speaking Lao. So, an extreme example. I'd been speaking Lao for about 2 years at that point, I guess. I've been speaking, practicing the language. So there are times, even when you don't claim a culture, when other people turn around and kind of claim you to some extent, like, oh, you're a foreigner, but you've put in the hard work to learn our language, study our history and our politics, so to some extent, we're claiming you. That's interesting. But no, I mean, back then, the point at which I started publicly identifying as a person who listens to rap, as a fan, no big deal, as a consumer of this culture, was the point at which I was really comfortable dealing with bullies who try to denigrate you and insult you because they assume that I want to pretend that I'm a part of that culture. And I'm not. That culture is a part of my life. Now, how many people listen to Western music and they're not cowboys? So, like, what are you going to say? Only if you actually ride a horse and work on a ranch, if only actual cowboys can listen to Western music? As a cultural phenomenon, I mean, I think it's a bit out of fashion now, but Western music about cowboys, millions of people listen to it who never rode a horse, who never owned a gun, who never lived through any of those situations, who never roped cattle. The word cowboy changed its meaning. Obviously, I am not a gangster. I'm not a rapper. I'm not part of the culture. I'm not part of the subculture associated with the creation of that. But the whole point is there's a much larger culture that consumes it, that listens to it, that's the audience for it. And I have absolutely no sense of shame, no sense of hesitation. I have no, to me, you're not insulting me by pointing those things out or by drawing my attention to those contradictions. I'm totally comfortable with those contradictions. The question is, are you comfortable with the contradiction that you claim Shakespeare? Like, if you're a white Canadian who thinks you're part of the same culture as Shakespeare, you're not. You may be part of the culture of the British Empire that's guilty of genocide in Canada. You may be part of all kinds of cultural legacies in reality. But no, you and Shakespeare, there's an ocean separating you from Shakespeare. And actually, the gap between you and a guy like Ghostface, it's not that wide. Actually, you could sit down and have dinner with Ghostface or any of the members of Wu-Tang. And I don't know what you talk about. Talk about the latest elections. Talk about what's in the newspaper. Actually, it wouldn't be that hard for you guys to relate to each other. It's not that alien. But I think that is something fundamental. When I was researching Buddhism, I wasn't pretending to be a Buddhist monk. I wasn't part of that culture, but that culture and that religion was part of my life. Now, again, some of those people claimed me. You know what I mean? They wanted to treat me like I was a Buddhist monk or like I was preaching that religion when I was studying it. And that's understandable. There are gray areas there. When you get into religion, it's kind of a different thing. But music and hip-hop culture, is not a religion. It doesn't have those elements. So, long story short, what importance did hip-hop have in my life? When I was in Toronto, during that period of time, it was very much an ascendant culture. It went from being something marginal, hated, and feared to totally redefining the mainstream. I saw that happen. Music that when it first came out was considered shocking and threatening and rebellious, 20 years later is being played as background music at the mall when people are shopping for bargain clothes. That's an amazing transformation to me, but I think a lot of people who grew up in the 1960s saw the same thing. Music that in the 1960s was considered shocking and rebellious and politically provocative, 20 years later in the 1980s was being played as background music at the mall. So it's not a completely unique cultural and historical experience, but that's my generation. I saw that happen with hip-hop. So there's nothing particularly surprising in the fact that hip-hop happens to be the music I listen to. But while I was still in Toronto, while I was still in Canada, it was less important to me than it was after I moved to Asia. I had years, like when I was in Laos, I had long periods of time where I never really spoke to anyone in English. Like, if you went to the pharmacy, the guy who works at the pharmacy would speak to you in broken English, but where I was speaking Lao all day, every day, and where I very rarely heard the English language spoken well. So, if I was communicating with people, maybe you buy an airplane ticket, and the guy working at the counter speaks to you in English, in good enough English to buy the airplane ticket, obviously. But the importance rap music had in my life really escalated, really ramped up when I was no longer hearing idiomatic, fluent, persuasive, passionate English being spoken by the people around me. So it was at that point, probably living in Vientiane. I already listened to hip-hop for years before that, but it didn't feel that important in my life. And at that time also, I was still listening to classical music. And when I was living in Laos, studying Pali, studying Lao, studying the history and politics of that part of Southeast Asia, that was when I really plunged into heavily listening to hip-hop all the time and nothing else. Everything else dropped out of my listening schedule. I stopped listening. The last couple of white artists disappeared from my hard drive, just to be blunt. There were only a few then, and that's when I stopped listening to Johann Sebastian Bach and the more metrical classical music, and when it really became more rewarding for me to hear the language used in that way. And so long story short, that's never left. Now, another really interesting turning point in my life, around the time my daughter was born, I thought, raising my daughter, I thought, okay, now for 10 years, hip-hop is going to disappear from my life. Because I wasn't going to listen to gangster rap in front of my daughter as a toddler. So there was actually a point when I deleted all the rap off my hard drive because I was 110% committed to raising my daughter. Now, those of you who watched this channel before know I'm divorced. So after I got divorced, I ended up loading up my hard drive again. But that was another interesting turning point where it was like, okay, you realize this music that has such a high level of slang and profanity and, such a big role for reflections on violence and what have you, that was going to disappear from my life and disappear from my computer for a while. So, that was another moment when that stuff was meaningful. Well, anyway, an especially meaningful moment for me. Now, some of you might ask, nobody ever has asked, but some of you might ask, given that I'm a vegan, given that I believe in minimizing violence towards animals and people wherever possible, why would I listen to a genre of music that has such a relentless focus on violence? Look, I come out of a hard brass tacks political science background. All the books I read, whether it's ancient Greek philosophy or modern political science, the fact that peace exists in the shadow of war, that civility and manners and, human civilization exists in the shadow of the constant threat of violence, that ain't something new to me. That ain't something strange. And that ain't something particular to rap music. Again, you can compare rap music to cowboy music. There are many other genres of music and literature. You can compare it to Shakespeare. How many people get stabbed in the average Shakespeare play? There's a lot of violence in Shakespeare, too. From Titus Andronicus on down, man. So, the role of violence in hip-hop, it is significant, and I do think it's actually meaningful to have an art form that is so much engaged in a meditation on the role of violence in our lives, the shadow it casts over our lives. I don't think that's meaningless at all. And, I think that does connect to my philosophy of veganism in just one simple sense, and I'll end this video there. I think it's true that all of us choose if we're going to live lives of escapism or if we're going to live lives of confrontation. You can look at the reality of a cow having its throat cut in a slaughterhouse, whether that's in a video or a photograph or a newspaper article. You can look at the reality of what mass production of meat is, what that industry is. And you can choose to evade it. You can choose to lie to yourself. You can choose to make up excuses. You can choose to live a life of self-deception and of comforting half-truths. Or you can choose to confront it. And you know what? Both, in their way, are actually kind of emotionally devastating. This channel, I mostly talk about how the vegan path is emotionally exhausting and so on. But all the time, I talk to meat eaters who are extremely emotionally fucked up about where their food comes from. They've taken that other path, but it leads to their own, its own problems. And, I am someone who wanted to face up to the reality of violence, both real, direct violence in the simplest sense, and more symbolic and abstract violence, like the fact that when I grew up, the threat of nuclear war totally defined the society and politics around me, etc. So yes, in that one sense at least, both veganism and my engagement with hip-hop music, with gangster rap, with the more hardcore edge of hip-hop music, that does reflect something about my character. And I don't think it's a bad thing.